Germans will vote in a snap election on February the 23rd in a poll in which the far-right Alternative for Germany party is expected to get its best ever result in a national election. In this episode, we speak to an expert in German far-right extremism about the rise of the AFD to understand where it draws its support from and what type of Germany it wants to return to. I'm Gemma Ware, and this is The Conversation Weekly, the world explained by experts. Joining me for this episode is Laura Hood, a senior politics editor at The Conversation in the UK. Hi, Laura.
Hi, Gemma.
So, Laura, part of your job is also covering European politics, and you work closely with our colleagues across the editions in Europe. So tell us, why is Germany about to have an election?
So the coalition government of Olaf Scholz collapsed at the end of last year. The partners within that coalition fell out over economic direction and energy plans. And as a result of that falling out, Scholz had to call a fresh election. This election is being observed more closely than the usual German election. And that's because of the rise of the Alternative for Germany, the AFD. That's a party of the extreme right. What started out as a campaign about the economy, because that's what was the trigger initially, has actually become something that's much more about immigration. And the AFD has capitalised on a spate of violent but isolated crimes that have involved migrants to further its intensely anti-immigration message. There are obviously lots of reasons why a party of this kind coming to such power would deter people across Europe. But as you can imagine, in Germany, given its specific history, it's extra worrying.
And how is the AFD actually doing in the polls? And what does that mean in the German political system, which is really focused around coalition building?
So it's been consistently polling at around 20% of the vote nationally. That puts it on course to be its most successful election result ever, if that comes to pass. And crucially, it puts it in second place behind the Christian Democrat parties, the CDU and the CSU. That's ahead of Olaf Scholz's Social Democrats. Something that is really important to understand, and is often not that well understood outside of Germany, is that German elections don't tend to produce the kind of single-party governments that we are accustomed to in many countries in the Western world. It's completely standard for a coalition of multiple parties to be negotiated after the results come in, and unlikely that any single party would win enough votes to govern alone. So even if the AFD did come first, for example, they wouldn't be expected to enter into government alone.
So what might then happen then if they did come second?
Well, this is the big question that's hanging over the election, right? Because mainstream parties like the CDU, CSU and Scholz's Social Democrats have always had this firewall in place saying that they would not collaborate, they would not put a coalition together with parties of the extreme right, such as the AFD. But these kinds of norms were put in place in a world where the AFD wasn't the second biggest party in the polling. So that really is creating quite a lot of uncertainty about what will happen after the vote. All the parties continue to maintain that they would absolutely never go into government with the AFD. But recent events in the parliament have thrown that into more question than many people are comfortable with.
And there was a particular vote around this just a few weeks ago, wasn't there, that brought it up to the fore and really sparked debate about what might happen after the election?
Yeah, so what happened was the CDU, the party of the centre-right, led by Friedrich Merz, the man who's most likely to be the chancellor after the election, took a really big swing further to the right with this 5-point immigration package that they put to Parliament.
He's already announced that he's going to rely on support from the far-right AFD to get his plans through Parliament.
This was opposed by many of the mainstream parties, but supported by the AFD. And Merz got his package passed through Parliament with the help of votes from the AFD, which is something that really has not happened before and has led many people to feel like it's a Rubicon crossed, basically. He has effectively partnered with the AFD in this vote. It's really important to say that this vote was not binding and it subsequently was defeated in Parliament at a more formal vote. But it's more the symbolism of what happened that day, which has got people particularly worried about what his intentions are as and when he enters government.
And you've recently been to Germany to visit one of our partner universities there, the University of Tübingen, which is in southwest Germany. And it was there that you first met Rolf Frankenberger, an expert in the far right in Germany. Tell us about that visit and meeting Rolf.
Yeah, so I, in fact, was in Germany the day after Scholz's government collapsed. He hadn't yet called the election, but everyone knew that that was going to be his intention. It was very much in the air. I went to visit Rolf at the university's Institute for Research on Far-Right Extremism. He's the managing director there and leads a team of researchers who look into all kinds of extreme politics. They do a lot of work on conspiracy theories, a lot of work on anti-Semitism. And as you can imagine, in Germany, these are very, very tense topics to be researching. So when I went to see him in his offices, I didn't actually know exactly where they were. The building is not particularly well labelled. There are no labels or signposts to his offices because they obviously have to be very, very strict about their security.
Mm. And after meeting Rolf, we decided that he'd be a great person to help us explain the rise of the AfD and what it symbolises. And we're going to hear that interview now. Where did you start your conversation with him?
So I started out asking him what got him into researching far-right extremism in the first place.
I can trace that one back to my youth because we were faced with skinhead hooligans in our area. So there was always like a controversy, or sometimes it was even more. So I was rather on the leftist political side of anti-fascism, and yeah, that this later translated in the academic interest. I'm a political scientist by training, and I was always interested in authoritarian regimes, dictatorship, fascist regime in Germany, of course, and then also current developments of far-right extremism.
And those current developments you mention are really centred around the rise of the AFD, the Alternative for Germany, which is on course to get 20% of the vote in the elections in February. Can you give us a brief history of that party?
So the party was founded in 2013 as a Eurosceptical, let's say conservative, but also neoliberal party with a lot of academic expertise from economics and law sciences. It had a focus on economic policy, independence of the national bank, anti-euro, and more independent economic policies for Germany, and a reduction of the responsibilities of the European Union. So it was a Eurosceptical party, but not a nationalist or far-right party. On the other hand, this made this party very attractive because Euroscepticism is a catch-all argument for most of the rightist movements in Europe, and people from further right moved into this party. And during the course of the following years, there was a lot of change in leadership in the party. And those people like Bernd Lucke, who was a neoliberal conservative, were forced more or less to move out. Frauke Petry as well, who were not that rightist as the nowadays leadership of the AfD. So this was a process of radicalization and a focus on a nationalist agenda more and more.
And what political and social forces were at work between that period of 2013 and now, which prompted this radicalization?
I think these were several developments. Of course, the economy matters. So we had the financial and economic crisis 2008 and following years, which impacted the economy in Germany as well.
A large majority of Germans doesn't want to pay for the Greek bailouts, but a large majority also accepts that Germany has no choice.
This was something that brought about the skepticism against European economic policies. Then we had the civil war in Syria with a lot of people fleeing to Germany. It was about 1 million people that came to Germany in search for a secure life until the civil war was ended.
Chancellor Angela Merkel is under pressure at home from Germans who are furious with the open arms policy she started in summer. She defends spending billions on programs to take in war refugees as a moral duty. This
was something that was politicized by the far right in a very extreme way. They were speaking about floods of immigrants, of a tsunami of migrants, criminalized these people in a way. So most of them were considered to be illegal because they moved through other countries like Hungary and so on. A third development closely linked with the same movements of people was the war in Ukraine that was started by Russia, which also led to a large group of people fleeing from the Ukraine and fleeing from the war. And the last development was the corona pandemic. There was a lot of discussion about the limitation of civil rights, of right of movement, right of assembly. On the one hand, on the other hand, the question how restrictive should the measures be to prevent people from getting ill and to unfold. And this was also politicized by the AFD, and it was very interesting to see because they were the first who said, oh, we need a lockdown. Before all the other parties said something about it, they said we need a strict lockdown to stop this pandemic. And then very quickly, when measures started, they made a U-turn 180 degrees and said, oh, here our fundamental rights are damaged and we're going into a dictatorship in the crisis and there's no freedom of speech anymore and so on. So it's in a way an opportunistic party that uses all the incidents that are there to bring forward their agenda.
Could we consider the AFD to be libertarian in its outlook, or was it just pure opportunism that led it to oppose lockdowns?
I would not say libertarian. They cannot be compared to the libertarian movements in the US who are clearly anti-state, who are clearly for a limited influence of the state. The tradition of the far right in Germany, it's for a strong state. Maybe a small state, but a strong state that regulates in their sense. For example, regulates migration, for example, deregulates climate change measures and so on. So they are skeptical against the state as it is at the moment, but they would like to replace it by a stronger state with very clear hierarchical structures, authoritarian structures. That's quite for sure, even though they always argue we need more direct democracy, we need more participation. This is rather lip service than a real strategy, actually.
What are the most significant political proposals that we should know about that are being put forward by the AFD in this election?
They were able to focus the whole campaigning of all the parties on the topic of migration. Basically stopping migration, having very restrictive claims for migration policy and also a term remigration. You might have heard of that. Donald Trump, he borrowed it from the AfD basically to bring people with a migration background back to their home countries, into parentheses, where they belong to, because in the view of the AfD, many of them are illegal and do not fit into the culture of Germany, into the everyday life of Germany. And they were able to force the other parties into this discourse. And this is the overarching pattern in this election will be migration.
In terms of support for the AFD, are people largely drawn to it because of its migration policies? Are these people who feel that migration is the most salient issue?
Yes and no. Yes, of course. It seems to be an issue. I think in the last opinion polls, it was like 70% of the people saying migration is the most important topic in the electoral campaign, which is enormous and actually doesn't meet the real challenges we have to deal with at the moment. The AfD is telling a narrative of the destruction of German culture, of the German heritage, of what they call Leitkultur. The long-lasting, 1,000-year-old tradition of Germany is something that is referred to, excluding the Second World War and the Third Reich, of course, because this can't be a point of reference for them. They basically have very similar ideas in terms of migration policy, in terms of economic policy and others. And this narrative of destruction of German culture is also linked to the use of language, gender equality, LGBTQI community, and rights of these communities. So basically they are trying to turn back the wheel to the 1950s, actually. So we have the traditional family led by a man, where the woman is subordinated to the man and to a very traditional patriarchal society. That is the main idea, and this is, of course, linked with the so-called leftist elites that are responsible for all this wokeness, as they call it, and they mean it negative, of course. It's also what they call Überfremdung, so too many people from abroad coming to Germany, too many new cultures and influences that destroy our way of life. Especially Islam is highly criticized, which fits well into a worldwide pattern of anti-Muslim feelings and opinions. So this comes together in a kind of traditionalist, nationalist, anti-modern narrative of the AfD. And this seems to be interesting for many people, as they in their everyday lives obviously experience difference, experience ideas that diverge from their own ideas. Maybe they cannot deal with them and they sometimes feel a loss. And of course, also the economic situation is another driving force behind that, because many people fear losses of income or jobs and status, of course.
And the idea of remigration has made it directly into the election campaign. In January, in the city of Karlsruhe, one regional branch of the AFD distributed fake one-way deportation tickets with a tagline reading, "Only remigration can still save Germany." This action is currently under investigation by German police for potential incitement to hatred. What kind of signals is this giving?
The message to people with a migration history is clear. You are not welcome. Go away. On the backside of this ticket, there are like some policy advices and references to legal prescriptions and the implementation of law. So the AfD can say, oh no, it's just like a policy paper. But what people feel when they read it, when they are meant to be the target of this, it's horrible, it's disgusting. And of course, this has predecessors in the past. I mean, this is not the first time that a far-right party did that. It was the National Democratic Party, NPD, which was even further right than the AfD, who did it twice in the 2010s and earlier. And we also have references of such tickets to Palestine that were handed out by the NSDAP in 1930, for example.
That's the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi party that was led by Hitler.
So the narrative changed a little bit from anti-Semitic to anti-migrant, but this is nothing new that the AfD does here. It's a scandalization, it's a provocation of the democratic public, actually.
Yeah, so I think this is something that we see with far-right parties across Europe, isn't it? It's an oblique reference to something that happened in the past that they can plausibly deny was a deliberate tactic, but anyone can see that there's a pattern of tactics. Something else that came up when we've talked about your work is a term that doesn't really mean much to people outside Germany, which is Völkisch nationalism. Mm-hmm. Could you explain to us what that means and what it means to a German ear?
The Volk is the entity that comprises all people of German origin, like bloodlines and historical rootedness in the area of Germany, which is, of course, a construction. Yeah? But the idea of Volk is like an organism. So individuals are not that important. It's the organism, the Volk as such, that is important. Then the Volk should grow and be nourished and should be protected. The rootedness in nature and landscape or traditional landscape and thousands of years of tradition of Germany. I'm ironizing it a little bit because, as we all know, Europe is a place where migration and mobility of people was the pattern throughout the last 2,000 years. So it's interesting idea that there is something like an organism of Volk, and Völkisch refers to the whole ideology behind that. So the thinking of unity, the thinking of acting together for a common goal that is essentially natural. It's God-given maybe, or it's given by nature, so that the Germans are a culturally rich, deep-thinking, privileged race or Volk. So they do not use the word race, of course, in the Völkisch literature. And this traces back to the 19th century and even earlier. The Germans are a quite young nation compared to the English, for example, or to the Irish or the French, because German unification only happened after 1870, really. So when Prussia and the German Reich were unified, and this whole narrative was aiming to contribute to a consciousness as a nation in a way. And this was very quickly turned into a more racist, more exclusionary anti-Semitic narrative. And anti-Semitism of the Third Reich has its roots in this thinking, actually.
So a German ear would pick up not just ideas about unity, but about superiority.
Yeah, and exclusiveness and an ideology of inequality. So we're superior.
How does the AFD play on this idea of Völkisch nationalism?
So in the last 12, 13 years, the AfD more and more adopted these ideas of keeping the Volk separated, so keeping bad influences from outside out, and strengthening the idea of being German, being something special that has to be protected, and highlighting traditions, highlighting customs. And this more and more became racist and exclusionary in some parts of the AfD.
This also relates to some work you've been doing to map support for the AfD geographically across Germany.
Mm-hmm.
Support for the AfD is firstly concentrated far more in the east of the country than it is in the west. What explains that?
There are some historical and some more actual explanations. If you think about before 1989, Eastern Germany was the former German Democratic Republic, and this German Democratic Republic was by official definition an anti-fascist state. The official language was there has never been and there will never be far-right extremism in the German Democratic Republic, but still underneath the surface we had a lot of far-right ideologies still growing. And like in Western Germany, there is like a continuity of far-right thought. And after reunification, there was a kind of outbreak of liberty for also far-right extremism to be expressed. This was one thing. I think the second thing is that reunification in Germany produced winners and losers. And in the view of many of East German people, and much of it is true, there are inequalities that were produced by a reunification. It was like exploitation of the East and an ignorance against all those achievements that have been made in the German Democratic Republic concerning equality of women, concerning childcare and schools and so on. And this also contributed to a kind of skepticism, state skepticism. So the AfD comes in and says, hey, there's something wrong with the state. There's something wrong with democracy, and there's something wrong with our heritage. Yeah? So we have a strong German heritage, we have an identity, we have an idea, and all the others try to destroy it. So it's a kind of protest, it's a kind of identity problem, and these factors play together. And that's why in Eastern Germany, the levels are much higher than in many parts of Western Germany. But still, we have strongholds in Western Germany as well.
And in Western Germany, what characterizes those strongholds largely?
We can look at Germany as a whole in a way, because we then can talk about an intriguing finding which separates cities from villages, which separates the urban areas from the rural areas, where we can clearly see, and that is also true for the East, but on another level, that internationalized, globalized, academicized cities are quite resilient against the AfD, whereas the more rural areas, the more remote areas are rather more strongholds of the AfD than the urban areas. And this becomes clear if you look, for example, at like university cities and their suburbs, and then the remote country around it. And there you can see there's a difference of like 10 or even more percentage points of voter turnouts for the AfD.
And what kind of issues are being seized upon by the AfD in these rural areas?
The urban centers are more plural, they are more vibrant. There are many different people from many different countries with different ideas that come together, and it works more or less well. They are also far more included in global production chains and global exchange of media and all these things that come together. And they are like the breeding cells for new developments, like wind energy, for example, like the whole climate change movement is a rather urban thing, actually. The rural areas, they are much more traditional. They're much more homogeneous in terms of people, in terms of traditions, customs. They're much more religious in a way. They're much more conservative in a way. And all these things would go together well if people talk to each other. But when it comes, for example, to the question of where should we build a home for migrants, where should we build wind parks or photovoltaic parks, and where should we build new plants, for example, or in industrial production, then this difference between rural and urban can be politicized and activated. And so it's a fairy tale of all the evil coming from the city or coming from urban areas, which are dominated by liberal, leftist, greenish elites. That's the narrative that is told, and they want to forbid us our way of life.
You mentioned the town of Pforzheim in southern Germany as emblematic of these trends. Can you describe Pforzheim for us? Why Pforzheim and what's been happening there?
It's interesting because Pforzheim is not so small. It's a city with more than 100,000 inhabitants, which is quite a lot for southern Germany. So Stuttgart, the biggest city, has 600,000, and it's the fifth largest city in Baden-Württemberg, for example. It was an industrial center before World War II. It was completely destroyed in World War II. So afterwards, there was a little bit of reconstruction of the city and also of the industry, so that it kept its urban center and also academics living there, but also working class people living there. The city center is quite multicultural, international. On the other hand, it's in the center of a more rural area, the northern Black Forest, and it's surrounded by very remote areas and by very traditional thinking. And the city of Pforzheim as such is divided. You can really feel this division of rural and urban within the city, because we have outskirts of the city that are completely rural. They are small villages that now belong to the city. They are strongholds of the AfD. And we have parts of the city where a lot of people with migration background from the Soviet Union live. So these are people with German origins. You could trace them back like 200 years or so when they moved to Russia on invitation. And in the 1990s, a lot of them came back and they brought with them rurality, traditionalism, conservatism, religious beliefs. They are also a kind of stronghold of the AfD. In one election in 2016, I guess, in the regional elections, the AfD in this particular part of Pforzheim had 45%, which is the same as in Eastern Germany. And there you can see those differences at work and how they polarize within one city.
So you effectively have an urban-rural divide in one place.
Exactly. And that's the typical pattern, because a lot of people move out of the cities. That's a trend in southern Germany. They look for a small village where they can live and raise their kids and still are working in the city. They're commuting and they try to find access to village life. And if there are conflicts, like building a refugee home or like a wind park or so, then these people might be mobilized by different political parties, the more urban ones by the more progressive party, and the more rural ones by conservative and far-right parties. And then you really have this conflict, and this conflict might escalate.
You've seen this urban-rural pattern play out across the whole of the country. So when you've mapped out support for the AfD, what you found is that support is far higher in rural areas than it is in urban areas.
There are always exceptions, of course, but the main pattern is that around the big cities like Berlin, like Hamburg, Bremen, Hanover, Münster, Stuttgart, Munich, Frankfurt, in these cities and their direct environment and suburbs, the AfD is less important. They have lower vote shares, whereas in the specific rural areas, like in Saxonia, in the Erzgebirge, in Baden-Württemberg, in the Black Forest, in Rhineland-Palatinate, in the more rural areas, they have their strongholds. So that's a pattern and can be mapped, and you can see it quite clearly.
Does that sort of imply that the space for growth for the AfD is limited? If it's not progressing into cities, if it's got these kind of fringe extremists, are we witnessing the peak of its power, or are we heading further into growth for the AfD?
Deep in my heart, I hope that these are the limits, and this was the peak, but I'm quite sure that this is not the case. The more uncertain our times are, and our times are quite uncertain, especially the political situation at the moment is also uncertain. We have a very clever far-right party with the AfD. They're acting strategically. They are able to force others into their discursive lines. And so I would argue it's not the peak. It will go on, and they will reach 30% at some time, and hopefully not more. But then I think it strongly depends on what the democratic parties in Germany do, especially the conservatives, the CDU. And at the moment, it's not that clear where the CDU is going to, with Friedrich Merz as its new leader and candidate for being chancellor. And he might be the new chancellor after 23rd February. The CDU is bringing in some proposals to implement stricter migration policy, to close borders, to have pushbacks at the national borders, to have border controls, which several of these ideas are against European law, basically. So they have adopted several of the ideas of the AfD, maybe having in mind to gain voters from them and limit their influence. But this is a very dangerous way of moving forward, because usually people would vote for the original and not for the copy.
I'm very excited for the AfD, and I think you're really the best hope for Germany.
We've noticed from the outside looking in, it was interesting to see Elon Musk, the world's richest man, basically come out for the AFD and conduct a conversation with leader Alice Weidel on X quite early on in the election campaign. What effect has that had?
It's very polarizing because, on the one hand, Elon Musk, he dominated Alice Weidel in a way, and he made her smaller as she is. But on the other hand, there is this clear linkage to the US radical right policies that are going on the moment, and the radicalization of migration policy there. And also a discussion about the influence of super rich persons is now going on in Germany. They are not so visible here, but we have a lot of super rich persons in Germany who usually were not that active as the super rich or like Musk in the US are. And this sheds a light on the question of how the AfD will position itself to oligarchy.
So we have the election on the 23rd of February. The AfD is not going to win. What does the political landscape look like after the election, if we are talking about it hovering at around 20% of the vote?
It will be a very difficult situation. If we're looking at opinion polls at the moment, the CDU will win the elections with about 30% or so. And then there will be the AfD with 20 plus, I would say. Then we have the Social Democrats, the SPD, who will jump over the 5% hurdle to get into parliament with like 16, 17% maybe, and the Greens with 13%. And the others might not gain enough votes to get into parliament at all. We have a limited options of coalition forming, that there will be no party that has a majority, an absolute majority, so that we will again have a coalition government. And the negotiations might be very difficult because on the one hand, the CDU does not want to form a coalition with the AfD. But on the other hand, they are also very hesitant to do it with the Greens. And maybe the Social Democrats will say, no, you gain the elections, we will not join a government. So this could lead to the same situation as it was before in last elections or the elections before, where it took almost half a year to form a government.
So do you think that it's not impossible that one of the other parties would end up in coalition with the AfD?
I actually don't think that this will happen, but there will be a lot of discussions and the AfD will gain. Compared to the last elections, the AfD will overall gain. It will also reinforce this urban-rural divide, I would say, and the contrast between East and West will be leveled out a little bit.
Rolf, there's a lot going on ahead of your election. We wish you well, and we'll be watching with interest. Thank you very much indeed.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Laura, this has been a really fascinating conversation you've had with Rolf, and I know he's also written an article for The Conversation about some of his research about the AfD. What struck you, though, working with him about the significance of this moment for Germany?
I think speaking to Rolf, many of the themes that crop up again and again and again when we're talking about populism and right-wing politics globally are clearly in evidence in Germany. The clash of cultures and of values and the politics of resentment and the backlash among people who feel left behind. But what's unique to Germany is how plainly this division maps onto post-communist reunification. If you have a look at the maps that Rolf has put together in his article, you can see this in stark visual terms. The AfD has strong support in the East and barely any support in the West. And he's got some really interesting thoughts on why this geographical split has occurred. Given that we are globally trying to grapple with these issues and these trends, to my mind, I think novel data of this kind is really, really useful. It adds a new dimension to a question that we're all trying to answer. And I think if it helps build a picture of what's going on, it can hopefully push us forward into some solutions.
Well, thanks so much, Laura. It's been great having you on.
Thanks, Gemma.
That's it for this week's episode. You can read more about the German election on The Conversation, and we'll put some suggested articles in our show notes. We'll also put a link there to where you can sign up to our dedicated Europe newsletter, which brings together articles from across our editions in Europe every Thursday. This episode was produced by Mend Marawani, with sound design by Michelle Macklem and theme music by Nita Saul. Stephen Kahn is our global executive editor. If you'd like to get in touch with us, please email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com. The Conversation is a non-profit news outlet dedicated to sharing the work of academic experts with a wider audience. If you like what we do, please support us at donate.theconversation.com. That's donate.theconversation.com. And please do also rate and review the show wherever you follow us. It really does help us reach more people. Thanks very much for listening.